Good morning, students. Today we will continue with the story, the last lesson. Let me do a little recap. We had read that Franz reaches school late, and so he was afraid of getting a scolding from M. Hamel. Anyhow, when he reaches there, he finds a total scenario that was different from other days in the school. It was quite as Sunday morning. His teacher had put on his fine Sunday clothes, and the back benches were occupied by the village people, and his classmates were already on their desk. His teacher, M. Hamel, told them that an order had come from Berlin that from next day German would be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine, and French was banned. When he heard this, then he comes to realize that it was in the honor of his last lesson that his teacher had put on fine Sunday clothes. And now he understood why the old men of the villages were sitting there in the back of the room, and it was all because they were feeling sorry too for not going to school. And then M. Hamel told them about, the French language, and all these village people had come on the last day to pay a tribute to their nation, which was no more theirs. And secondly, they wanted to thank M. Hamel for his 40 years of his service. When he was thinking of all this, he heard his name called, and it was now his turn to recite. He would have loved to give the answer without any mistake, but he got mixed up on the very first word. So now I will read for you and then I will explain. But I got mixed up on the first word and stood there holding on to my desk, my heart beating and not daring to look up. I heard M. Hamel say to me, "I won't scold you, little Franz. You must feel bad enough. See how it is. Every day we have said to ourselves, 'Bah, I have plenty of time. I will learn it tomorrow.' And now you see where we have come out. Ah, that's the great trouble with the Else. She puts off learning till tomorrow." But when Franz got mixed up with the first word, he did not dare to look up. He was feeling bad. So he was just looking down. And then his teacher, M. Hamel, said to him that he won't scold him. Why? Because he is also realizing that Franz is feeling very bad. Then he tells that the people of Alsace had told them every day that they had plenty of time. The students had thought that they would learn it to the next day. And now he wanted to make them realize that this was the place they have come out, that they don't know about their language, French. Ah, that's the great trouble with Alsace. She puts off learning till tomorrow means the students of Alsace had the habit of putting the things to next day, thinking that they had lot of time. Now those fellows out there will have the right to say to you, "How is it you pretend to be Frenchmen and yet you can neither speak nor write your own language? But you are not the worst, poor little Franz. We have all a great deal to reproach ourselves with. Your parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. They preferred to put you to work on farm or at the mills so as to have a little more money. And I have been blamed too also." Now here he tells the students that those fellows means the German people, they will now tell them, they will mock at them that these people pretend to be Frenchmen, but they can neither speak nor write their own language. But you are not the worst, poor little Franz. So here he says not only Franz, but also other students, other people over there, they did not learn their language. we all have a great deal to reproach ourselves with. So this is very important line. We have all a great deal to reproach ourselves means here he makes everyone responsible for this condition. How? We will read. Your parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. So he blames first he blamed the students for having the habit of putting the things to tomorrow. Next he blamed the parents. Why? Because they did not, want their children to learn. Instead, they preferred to put them to work. So they send them to the farm or to the mills to earn some more money. And I have been to blame also. So somewhere he also blames himself for such condition. Have I not often sent you to water my flowers instead of learning your lessons? And when I wanted to go fishing, did I not just give you a holiday? So here he blames himself by telling that he often sent the students to water his plants, and whenever he wanted to go for fishing, he would just give them a holiday off from the school. Then from one thing to another, M. Hamel went on to talk of the French language, saying that it was the most beautiful language in the world, the clearest, the most logical, that we must guard it among us and never forget it. Because when a people are enslaved, as long as they hold fast to their language, it as if they had the key to their prison. So then he tells them about the French language. What he says? He says that French is the most beautiful language in the world, the most clearest and the most logical. He tells the people that they must guard it and they should never forget their language, because when they are enslaved, it is the key to their prison. Their language is key to their prison. So this is very important. They ask in the board, what does M. Hamel tells about French language? So he tells them that French language is the most beautiful language in the world, the most clearest, the most logical. He tells them never to forget it. He tells them that it was their key to their prison and it was their identity. Then he opened a grammar and read us our lesson. I was amazed to see how well I understood it. All he said seemed so easy, so easy. I think too that I had never listened so carefully, and that he had never explained everything with so much of patience. It seemed almost as if the poor man wanted to give us all he knew before going away and put it all into our heads at one stroke. After the grammar, we had a lesson in writing. So then, after the grammar class, then he opened a grammar and read as a lesson. So today, when he was teaching them grammar, Franz was understanding everything so nicely, so easily. Why? Because he was listening to it properly. Because he said, all he said seemed so easy, so easy. The reason, I think too, that I had never listened so carefully. So he was listening today to his teacher so carefully. That's why, he was able to understand. And second thing, the teacher also explained everything with so much of patience. Why? Because today M. Hamel wanted to give them all he knew before going away. As I told you, today was their last lesson in French. And he wanted to put all the things into their heads at one stroke. And after the grammar, we had a lesson in writing. That day, M. Hamel had new copies for us, written in a beautiful round hand, Franz Elsig, Franz Elsig. They looked like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom, hung from the rod at the top of our desks. You ought to have seen how everyone set to work and how quiet it was. The only sound was the scratching of the pens over the paper. Once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them, not even the littlest one, who worked right on tracing their fish hooks as if that was French too. So as I told you, then that after that they had a lesson in writing, and so for writing M. Hamel had brought new copies for them, for all of them, and on the notebooks, on the copies, it was written Franz Elsig, Franz Elsig, and these copies looks like flags floating everywhere in the classroom. Everybody, was so quiet. They were just doing their work. The only sound that was coming in the class was the scratching of the pens over the paper. Even the little children did not get distracted when some beetles flew in the class. They all were busy doing their work. On the roof of the pigeons cooed very low, and I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? Now this is very important. So when the narrator, when the Franz saw on the roof the pigeons, they were even cooing very low, and then he thought, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? Why? Because now German was being imposed on the people of France. So he thinks in his mind that will these German make these pigeons also to coo in the German language? Whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw M. Hamel sitting motionless in his chair and gazing first at one thing, then at another, as if he wanted to fix in his mind just how everything looked in that little schoolroom. So while the children were working, M. Hamel looked at one thing or another that was there in the class. Fancy, for 40 years he had been there in the same place, with his garden outside the window and his class in front of him just like that. Only the desks and the benches had been bone smooth. So with time, there were little changes in the class. So what were the changes? The first was the desk and benches had become smooth with so many of years, The walnut trees in the garden were taller. So the walnut trees, plants that were grown up in the garden by M. Hamel, they had become taller now. And the hop vine that he had planted himself twined about the windows to the roof. So the climber, the hop vine, also had, which was planted by M. Hamel, it had also gone from window to the roof. How it must have broken his heart to leave it all, poor man, to hear his sister moving about the room above, packing their trunks, for they must leave the country the next day. Since M. Hamel was French teacher and it was his last day there, next day he had to move, so his sister was packing the things about in the room, and that could be heard in the class. She was packing the things, she was packing the trunks, because next day they had to leave the country. But he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. After the writing, we had a lesson in history. So first they had a grammar class, then writing, and now they had a lesson in history. And then the babies chanted their ba, bi, be, bo, boo. Down there at the back of the room, old Hosser had put on his spectacles and, holding his primer in both hands, spelled the letters with them. You could see that he too was crying. His voice trembled with emotion, and it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. Ah, how well I remember it, that last lesson. So now, after the writing section, they had a lesson in history, and then the babies, little kids in the class, they chanted the alphabets. And down there at the bottom of the class, old Hosser, he was also having primer in his hand because he had not gone to school. He did not learn French at all. So today, on the last day, he also wanted to learn those alphabets. So he also, spoke out those words. And while doing that, he was crying. He was crying because he was feeling bad. His voice trembled with emotion. And Franz says that looking at him, we wanted to laugh and cry. Why laugh? Because, the way he was speaking the alphabets. Such a big man and, speaking the little alphabets. And then why cry? Because looking at him, they were feeling emotional. That it was the last day of their French language. How well I remember it, that last lesson. So that last lesson was remembered so well by Franz. All at once, the church clock struck 12, then the Angelus. At the same moment, the trumpets of the Prussians returning from drill sounded under our windows. M. Hamel stood up, very pale, in his chair. I never saw him look so tall. So then the church clock struck 12, then the Angelus, and at the same moment, the trumpets of the Prussians who were coming back from the drill, that the sound could be heard under the windows. M. Hamel stood up, very pale. Why very pale? Because he was feeling sad inside. In his chair, I never saw him look so tall. Now, basically, what does this mean? Why M. Hamel was looking so tall today? This was out of respect in the heart of the people, in the heart of little Franz, that he looked so tall. So that was the respect given to him by the people. My friends, said he. I. But something choked him. He could not go on. Then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large as he could, Vive la France. Then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall, and without a word, he made a gesture to us with his hand. School is dismissed. You may go. My friends, today he calls his student as my friends. He wanted to say something. He started with I, but then his throat got choked. He was, crying from inside. He could not speak on. Then he turned to the blackboard and taking a piece of chalk, he wrote with all his might, with all his power. He wrote in big, bold italic letters, Vive la France, which means long live France. What is that? Vive la France, which means long live France. And then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall. Basically, he was getting very emotional. He did not want to face the people. And without a word, he made a gesture to us with his hand. So he just makes a gesture to them with his hand, showing that school is dismissed. You may go. So I hope the lesson is clear to you. Clear? Okay, that's all for today. Goodbye.